12 children. No birth certificates. No records that they had ever existed at all. To neighbors, the Follings were saviors, a wealthy couple who opened their home to the forgotten. But behind the locked doors of their Victorian mansion, a nightmare was growing, one that would leave investigators reeling. This is the Ghastly Journal. Subscribe now, and join us as we uncover the macabre case of the Follings. Millbrook, Pennsylvania, wasn't the kind of place you'd expect to find your name in the papers. It was a town tucked between gentle hills and farmland, where families passed recipes down like heirlooms, and neighbors kept their doors unlocked. Church picnics, high school football, and casserole deliveries to the sick were the rhythms of life. For the 3,000 souls who called Millbrook home, it was a place where everyone knew everyone, and where the idea of evil belonged to far-off cities, not their own quiet streets. It was in this town that Howard and Margaret Falling appeared in the spring of 1978. They came with money, elegance, and a sense of purpose that charmed nearly everyone they met. Their home was a sprawling Victorian mansion on Elm Street, a house that had stood empty for nearly a decade. Locals whispered it was haunted, its shuttered windows and ivy-choked walls a reminder of better days. But Howard, a successful investment banker from Pittsburgh, saw potential in its sagging porches and cracked plaster. He and Margaret poured a small fortune into renovations, transforming the ruin into a showpiece. Soon, the house glowed with fresh paint, gleaming windows, and flower beds that Margaret herself tended with meticulous care. For those who lived nearby, it was as if the haunted house on the hill had been resurrected. They were the kind of people you wanted at your dinner table, recalled Elaine Winters, who lived across the street. Howard always wore a suit, even just checking the mail. And Margaret, she was so poised, elegant, the kind of woman who made you feel important just by talking to you. The Follings quickly became fixtures in the community. Howard donated to the local church and sat on the board of a children's charity. Margaret, a former pediatric nurse, offered health advice to mothers at parish gatherings. They hosted garden parties in the summer, complete with polished silver trays and wine imported from France. To outsiders, the couple seemed to embody the best of Millbrook. Wealth balanced with generosity, refinement softened by a PPROACHABILITY. But beneath the polish was something more fragile. Margaret had always wanted children, and the absence of a family weighed heavily on her. Neighbors often saw her sitting on the wide front porch, watching local children play in the street. She had this look, Winters remembered, like her heart was breaking, but she never said a word. When whispers finally spread that the Follings were planning to adopt, the town erupted in joy. Here was a couple with money, stability, and love to give. A couple who would give children a future. It seemed like the answer to Margaret's silent longing. In photographs from that period, the couple looked flawless. Howard tall and serious, Margaret radiant in her tailored dresses. But there is something in the shadows of those photographs, something neighbors would only recognize much later. A tension in the eyes, a hint of control in the way Margaret's hand always clutched Howard's arm a little too tightly. Even their newly restored home carried an air of duality. On the outside, its broad verandas and polished stained glass shone like a jewel in the neighborhood. But inside, the layout was peculiar. Locked rooms. Renovations no one was invited to see. Spaces whispered about, but never shown during Margaret's carefully guided tours. For years, these details slipped unnoticed, drowned out by the gleam of respectability. After all, who would question the couple who revived a decaying mansion, who brought elegance to potluck dinners, who seemed to embody the very heart of Millbrook? And yet, the facade was just that, a facade. Behind the freshly painted walls and warm handshakes, the Follings were preparing to build a family unlike anything the town had ever imagined. A family that would draw its children not from birth, but from shadows. A family with no paper trail, no birth certificates, and eventually, no way to hide from the darkness that would follow Dot in the summer of 1980. The Follings announced the news the town had been waiting for. They had adopted a baby boy. His name was James, and he was perfect. Chubby cheeks, bright eyes, a laugh that carried across the porch. The community embraced him as if he were their own. A surprise baby shower was held at the church. Neighbors dropped off toys and clothes, and Margaret was radiant with pride. For many, it felt like the Follings had finally been made whole. But James was only the beginning got within 2 years. Margaret and Howard adopted again, this time a little girl named Elizabeth. Then came Thomas, Catherine, and William in rapid succession. By 1985, the Follings were raising 5 children under the age of 6, all of them adopted, all without the long delays most couples faced when navigating Pennsylvania's adoption system. Normally, adoption was a drawn-out, often heartbreaking process. Waiting lists stretched for years. Couples endured endless home inspections, background checks, and interviews. But the Follings? Their approvals came with startling speed. Howard had connections, explained Detective Richard Cooper years later. He had money, influence, and a spotless reputation. Who was going to question a wealthy couple with a mansion and a nurse for a wife? They looked like the dream adoptive parents. At first, no one asked too many questions. The town was charmed by the growing brood. Neighbors waved as Margaret pushed a stroller down Elm Street. Parishioners admired the well-behaved children sitting neatly in a row during Sunday service. The Follings were praised as generous, even heroic, rescuing children who might otherwise have languished in the foster system. But beneath the admiration, small oddities began to surface. The children were rarely seen outside of church. They did not attend the local school. Margaret insisted on homeschooling, citing her background as a nurse and her belief in personalized education. When parents suggested playdates, she always had an excuse. The children were too busy with studies, too ill, or the family was traveling. I tried to set something up once, remembered Patricia Hayes, a former Millbrook resident. My son was the same age as James, and James seemed so lonely. But every time I asked, Margaret brushed me off. After a while, I stopped trying. Everyone did. Those few who glimpsed the children up close described something unsettling. At church, they sat in absolute stillness, hands folded, eyes forward. They didn't squirm, whisper, or fidget like normal children. They just stared. They looked like little soldiers, Hayes recalled. Blank faces, vacant eyes. It wasn't natural. Some neighbors rationalized this as discipline. Others dismissed it as shyness. But a few whispered that Margaret's grip on her children seemed less like love and more like possession. One incident in particular lingered in memory. During James's church blessing, Margaret resisted handing him to the pastor. Witnesses recalled her standing so close, hovering as if afraid he might be taken from her. She looked like a cornered animal, one parishioner later said. It was passed off as maternal protectiveness, but in hindsight, it was one of the first red flags. The pace of adoptions didn't slow. By the late 1980s, more children joined the household, each one arriving under circumstances that seemed murky at best. No one outside the family ever saw paperwork, and none of the children appeared to have birth certificates. When questioned, Howard and Margaret brushed off concerns. The agencies handle all of that, Howard would say with his practiced smile. We just want to give these children a home. The town, charmed by generosity and disarmed by wealth, accepted the explanation. After all, what harm could come from parents who dressed impeccably, donated generously, and raised their children in a spotless mansion? Yet to those paying close attention, the cracks were already visible. The children's isolation, their hollow eyes, the odd reluctance to share even the most basic records. And the speed, always the speed. Family after family added to the falling home, as though the couple were racing against some unseen clock, building a brood that seemed less like a family and more like an experiment. By the mid-1980s, the whispers in Millbrook had begun. Not accusations, not yet, but uneasy questions murmured over back fences and in pews after service. How could one couple adopt so many children so quickly? Why were they never at birthday parties, never on the school playground, never truly part of the community? Those whispers, faint at first, would one day grow into shouts. But for now, the town looked away, soothed by appearances and too polite, or too afraid, to confront what was happening behind the polished doors of the house on Elm Street. By the summer of 1987, the Falling household had grown into a bustling but strangely closed world. Neighbors occasionally glimpsed the children through lace curtains or filing silently into the family's pew at church, but few could claim to know them. From the outside, life seemed perfectly ordered, until the day a boy named Thomas fell from a tree. Thomas was 9 years old, wiry and adventurous. On a sweltering July afternoon, he climbed too high into the oaks that bordered the Follings property. He lost his footing and tumbled to the ground, landing with a sickening crack. The fall snapped his arm in 2 places, the bone jutting grotesquely through the skin. It was the kind of injury that demanded immediate medical care. But Margaret, a former pediatric nurse, made a fateful decision. Instead of rushing Thomas to the hospital, she tried to set the bone herself. Neighbors later recalled seeing curtains drawn tight that evening, lights flickering in the upstairs rooms, but no one realized what was happening inside. Margaret worked feverishly with bandages and splints, convinced she could handle the injury on her own. Days passed. Thomas's wound festered. The fracture became infected, his fever spiking dangerously high. Only then did Howard intervene. Overruling his wife, he bundled Thomas into the family car and drove him to Millbrook General Hospital. Dr. Sarah Chun was the attending physician on duty that night. She never forgot the sight of the boy brought into her care. His arm was grotesquely swollen, the skin red and hot with infection. The boy himself was eerily calm. He didn't cry, Chun recalled later. Not once, not even when we prepped him for emergency surgery. Most children would be hysterical. Thomas just stared at his father, waiting, as if he needed permission to react. Even stranger, when Dr. Chun asked how the injury had happened, Thomas hesitated. He glanced at Howard before answering in a flat monotone. I fell. For Chun, alarm bells rang. She asked for the boy's medical records, immunizations, pediatric visits, anything. None existed. Howard explained smoothly that the children's records had been lost in a fire at a previous adoption agency. His tone was polite, but there was an edge beneath it. When Chun pressed further, he snapped, threatening to transfer Thomas to another hospital. It was enough to raise serious suspicion. Dr. Chun filed a report with Child Protective Services, noting both the medical neglect and the absence of records. She feared she was glimpsing only the edge of something larger, something deeply wrong. A caseworker named David Morris was assigned to investigate. He visited the Falling home weeks later, walking through the grand hallways and neatly kept rooms. The children appeared healthy, clean clothes, tidy hair, polite manners. Margaret spoke eloquently about her homeschooling methods and her fear of hospitals, citing a traumatic childhood experience. Howard charmed the caseworker with his poise and his promises of providing the very best for the children. 3 weeks later, Morris filed his report. His conclusion: no evidence of abuse or neglect. The home environment is clean and safe, he wrote. Mrs. Follings' initial decision to treat her son's injury at home was misguided, but not malicious. Case closed, and just like that, the investigation ended. For Dr. Chun, the outcome was crushing. She had seen enough to know something was off, but without proof, her concerns were dismissed. For the town of Millbrook, the incident barely registered. Neighbors learned that Thomas had broken his arm, and that his mother, a nurse, had been simply overprotective. Most saw it as a minor scare in an otherwise flawless family story. But in hindsight, this was the turning point. The moment the system might have intervened, but chose not to. The moment when the facade of the Follings could have cracked wide open. Instead, the case was closed, and life in Millbrook went back to normal. Normal, at least, on the surface. Behind the locked doors of the Elm Street mansion, the children's world grew darker, their lives more controlled, their silence more complete, and the Follings, undeterred, continued to build their family, adding more children to the growing brood. Each new arrival erased further questions, burying unease under the weight of appearances. The town, and the system meant to protect its most vulnerable, had looked away, and because of that, the nightmare was allowed to continue. By the early 1990s, the Falling household had swelled to nearly a dozen children. Their presence loomed over Elm Street, a picture of orderly perfection. The children moved in tight clusters, never speaking out of turn, never wandering from Margaret's watchful eye. To longtime residents of Millbrook, the strangeness had become familiar. The whispers that once carried concern now dulled into acceptance. That's just how the Follings are, people said, but not everyone was willing to dismiss the unease. In the winter of 1992, a new family moved into a modest house just a few doors down from the mansion. Michael and Susan Fletcher, along with their teenage daughter, Emily. Michael had recently taken a position at the Millbrook Gazette, while Susan was a seasoned social worker with experience in child welfare cases. Susan noticed the oddities almost immediately. She had spent years working with abused and neglected children, and the signs were second nature to her. The Falling children flinched at sudden noises. They avoided eye contact, their gazes darting toward Margaret before answering even the simplest question. Their smiles seemed rehearsed, their movements too controlled. "I knew trauma when I saw it," Susan later told her daughter. Those children weren't shy. They were afraid. Determined to learn more, Susan sought out Margaret. The two women struck up a tentative friendship, often sharing coffee at the Falling home. Margaret seemed relieved to have a confidant. She spoke warmly about her children and her mission to give them better lives, though her words sometimes carried a sharp edge. During one of these visits, Susan noticed something unusual. On the third floor of the mansion, a door remained perpetually locked. From behind it came faint noises, shuffling, muffled crying. When Susan asked about it, Margaret laughed softly. "Just storage," she explained. "Old houses make strange sounds." But Susan was unconvinced. Not long after, she saw something that would haunt her forever. Standing in her front yard one spring afternoon, Susan glanced up at the Falling mansion. In a window high on the third floor, a face appeared, a girl with long dark hair, pale and thin. The child stared out for only a moment before vanishing from sight. Susan froze. She had met all of the Falling children, and this girl was not one of them. When she asked Margaret about it, Margaret brushed her off. "Oh, you must have seen Catherine or Elizabeth. The girls play up there sometimes." But Susan had no doubt this was someone new, someone hidden. Meanwhile, Michael's work at the Gazette was pulling him into dangerous territory. He had begun investigating adoption fraud across Pennsylvania and neighboring states. In the 1980s, several agencies had been shut down for placing children illegally, bypassing official paperwork to move children across state lines. Michael's research uncovered irregularities that coincided with the years the Follings had expanded their family. At home, he confided in Susan. "The timeline matches," he said grimly. "Every time the Follings adopt, there's another case of a missing or unregistered child." It can't be coincidence. Their daughter Emily, then a teenager, remembered the unease that hung in their household. My parents were careful, but I could tell they were afraid, she later recalled. They knew something was wrong, but the Follings were powerful. Everyone else seemed too scared to say it out loud. As Susan documented her observations, the flinches, the scripted answers, the hidden child in the window, a clearer picture began to form. The perfect family on Elm Street was not what it seemed. Behind the manicured gardens and polite smiles was a system of control, secrecy, and fear. A town, long accustomed to overlooking the strangeness, continued to keep quiet. But the Fletchers were outsiders. They had no history with the Follings, no reason to protect them, and no fear of questioning what others ignored. For the first time in years, the silence surrounding the Folling family began to crack, and what lay behind that crack would soon draw investigators into one of the most disturbing cases Millbrook and the nation had ever seen. In the spring of 1995, Susan Fletcher's health began to fail. She had been diagnosed with breast cancer the year before, and though she fought bravely, the illness progressed quickly. By May, she was confined to her home, her strength dwindling. Yet even as her own time slipped away, she could not let go of the fear that haunted her about the family on Elm Street. One evening, bedridden but determined, Susan summoned Detective Richard Cooper, a young officer she trusted. She handed him a file she had been compiling for months, notes scribbled during visits, observations of the children's behaviors, photographs of the mansion, and most damning of all, a snapshot of the third-floor window where she had seen the unknown child. She made me promise, Cooper later recalled. Promise that I'd keep looking after she was gone. She knew there was something wrong. She just didn't have the strength to fight it anymore. Susan died in June of that year. But her file lived on. Cooper began his investigation quietly, almost cautiously. He knew the Follings' reputation. Howard sat on charity boards, mingled with politicians, and was a personal friend of the mayor. Margaret was beloved in church circles, praised for her devotion to her children. Accusing them of wrongdoing without airtight proof could cost Cooper his career. Still, something in Susan's meticulous notes convinced him it was worth the risk. First thing he checked were the adoption records. Most were sealed, as state law allowed, but Cooper uncovered enough fragments to see a troubling pattern. Each adoption had been handled by a different agency, often across state lines. Each time, the Follings had made substantial donations to the agency involved, donations far larger than typical processing fees. On paper, it looked like generosity. In reality, it suggested manipulation. Even more troubling were the trust funds Howard had established for each adopted child. At first glance, they seemed like a gesture of love. Accounts that would provide financial security once the children reached adulthood. But the fine print revealed strict conditions. The money would only be released if the child maintained regular contact with the Follings and refrained from seeking information about their biological origins. It wasn't love, Cooper said later. It was control. Everything they did was about control. Still, paperwork alone wasn't enough. Cooper needed testimony. He began reaching out to former employees of the Folling household. Most had vanished without a trace, no forwarding addresses, no willingness to speak. Finally, he tracked down a woman named Maria Vasquez, who had worked as a housekeeper for the family in 1991. At first, Maria was hesitant. She had fled Millbrook in the middle of the night, terrified of what the Follings might do if they knew she disapproved of their methods. But when Cooper showed her Susan Fletcher's file, she broke down in tears. "Someone else saw," she whispered. "Someone else knows." Maria's account painted a chilling portrait of life inside the mansion. The children were bound by elaborate rules that changed constantly, ensuring they could never avoid punishment. They were forbidden from entering each other's rooms, cut off even from their siblings. They addressed Howard and Margaret only as Sir and Madam. Worst of all were the 3 rooms on the 3rd floor. Maria had been instructed to leave trays of food outside those doors 3 times a day, but she was never permitted to enter. She heard voices inside, children's voices, sometimes crying, sometimes singing softly to themselves. When she asked Margaret who they were, she was told they were special cases who required isolation. The final straw for Maria came one evening when she witnessed James, the eldest, being punished for speaking without permission at dinner. Margaret forced him to stand in a corner all night, checking on him every hour to ensure he hadn't moved. The boy trembled but did not resist. Maria quit the next morning and left Millbrook that very night, armed with Maria's testimony. Cooper felt he had enough to demand an official inquiry. He presented his findings to his superior, Chief Raymond Wallace. But the response was not what he hoped. The chief shook his head. "You don't have proof," he told Cooper. "You've got gossip, a bitter ex-employee, and a dying woman's suspicions. Do you realize who you're accusing? Howard Folling plays golf with the district attorney. He bankrolls half this town's charities. You bring me hard evidence, or you drop it." The message was clear. Leave the Follings alone. But Cooper couldn't. He had seen too many threads lining up. The missing records, the suspicious adoptions, the testimony of Maria, the notes of Susan. There were too many coincidences for it to be chance. He decided to press on, even if it meant working alone. Quietly, he began documenting everything in secret files he kept at his own home. He started cross-referencing the years of the Folling adoptions with missing child reports across Pennsylvania and neighboring states. The pattern he found was undeniable. Every time the Follings added a child to their family, another child in the same region disappeared. It was a horrifying possibility. The family on Elm Street was not just hiding children. They might be taking them. And if Cooper was right, time was running out for whoever was still locked behind those 3rd-floor doors. Detective Richard Cooper knew he couldn't carry the weight of the Folling case alone. By the fall of 1995, his unofficial investigation had uncovered too many disturbing parallels. Adoption dates that lined up with missing children, testimony of hidden rooms, donations that seemed more like bribes. Still, his own police chief had ordered him to drop it. So Cooper bypassed the chain of command. He sent a detailed report, including Maria Vasquez's testimony, Susan Fletcher's notes, and his own findings, directly to the Pennsylvania State Police. His file eventually reached Lisa Harper, a former colleague now working on a statewide task force for crimes against children. Harper took one look and knew the allegations couldn't be ignored. Within a week, a warrant was approved to search the Folling residence. But Harper and Cooper also knew the risk. The Follings had friends in high places. If word leaked, evidence could be destroyed, or worse, children could be harmed. A search had to be executed swiftly, without warning. On the morning of October 23, 1995, a convoy of unmarked vehicles rolled quietly up Elm Street. State troopers and FBI agents moved into position. Cooper, heart pounding, stood among them as the lead team approached the mansion's heavy oak doors. When they knocked, it was Howard who answered. He wore a silk bathrobe and slippers, his hair combed neatly as though he had been expecting company. "Good morning, officers," he said calmly. "Please, come in." His composure unsettled even the most seasoned agents. He wasn't surprised, Cooper recalled. It was as if he knew we were coming. Margaret was another story. The moment she realized what was happening, she shrieked in rage, clawing at the officers, screaming that they were violating God's house and traumatizing her children. She had to be restrained as the search began. Teams fanned out through the mansion. The 11 known Folling children were found in their bedrooms, each already awake and sitting fully dressed on the edge of their beds, as if waiting for inspection. They did not cry, did not ask questions, did not react with fear or curiosity. They recited polite greetings, their voices flat, their words eerily scripted. They were like mannequins, Harper later wrote in her report. Children emptied of spontaneity, responding only with rehearsed lines. It was one of the most unsettling things I have ever witnessed. But the real horror was on the third-floor dot, at the end of a narrow hallway. 3 heavy doors stood locked. When the officers broke them open, they found 3 children huddled in near darkness. A girl of about 10 and 2 boys, perhaps 8 years old. They recoiled from the light, shielding their faces, whimpering in terror. The rooms were bare, just stained mattresses on the floor. The windows were nailed shut, covered with blackout curtains. The air reeked of filth and neglect. These children weren't just hidden, Cooper said. They were erased. No toys, no books, no trace of a normal life. They didn't even appear in official records. To the outside world, they didn't exist. Medical examinations later revealed all 3 were severely malnourished and bore scars of physical abuse. None spoke fluent English. Investigators suspected they had been taken from vulnerable families, migrants, the poor, the overlooked, children unlikely to be missed quickly by a system already stretched thin. If the discovery of the hidden children was shocking, what investigators found next was even more disturbing. In Howard's study, concealed behind a panel in the wall, they uncovered a safe. Inside were stacks of falsified adoption papers, envelopes stuffed with cash in multiple currencies, and most chilling of all, a leather-bound journal in Margaret's handwriting. A journal spanned nearly 2 decades. In it, Margaret outlined what she called her sacred mission to create the perfect family. She described children as being born tainted by sin that had to be purged through ritual suffering. She divided her children into 2 categories: the redeemable, who could be molded into purity, and the vessels, whose role was to absorb the sins of others. The rituals were detailed in grotesque passages. Margaret wrote of forcing children to drink a bitter liquid to induce drowsiness, and reciting prayers or incantations while painting symbols on their skin. She described the transfer of sin as though it were a tangible substance, extracted from the redeemable and deposited into the vessels. Once a vessel was filled, she wrote, it would be discarded, its purpose served. The implication was horrifying. Somewhere on the property, or beyond, there might be discarded vessels. Cadaver dogs were brought in to search the grounds. At the far edge of the property, in a wooded patch that looked undisturbed, the dogs alerted. When investigators began to dig, they unearthed shallow graves. Small bodies wrapped in decaying cloth lay beneath the earth. 5 in total. Forensic experts determined the burials spanned more than a decade, beginning around 1981, shortly after James was adopted. The remains told their own story: malnutrition, dehydration, untreated illnesses. The children had not died quickly. They had been starved, neglected, slowly extinguished. 3 of the victims were eventually identified by matching descriptions from old missing person reports. Maria Gomes, age 9, disappeared from a migrant camp in 1981. Tyrell Washington, age 7, vanished from a Pittsburgh housing project in 1985. Alexei Petro, age 8, the child of Russian immigrants, last seen in Philadelphia in 1990. The other 2 remained unidentified, referred to only as Jane Doe No. 1 and John Doe #3 as the evidence mounted. Howard and Margaret were arrested on the spot. Margaret fought wildly, breaking free long enough to scream a torrent of words in what investigators later described as glossolalia, speaking in tongues. Some officers thought it was a religious rant. Others believed it was the babbling of a woman breaking down. Cooper, watching from the stairs, wondered if it was both. With the couple in custody, attention turned to the children. The 11 redeemables remained eerily loyal, repeating lines like, "Sir and Madam provide all we need. We are happy here." Deprogramming them would take years. The three hidden children, meanwhile, clung desperately to one another, too traumatized to speak, flinching at any sudden movement. The courtroom drama that followed was as twisted as the crimes themselves. Margaret was declared incompetent to stand trial, diagnosed with severe delusional disorder, and committed to a psychiatric facility. Howard's attorneys attempted to paint him as an unwitting accomplice, a man so absorbed in his business dealings that he had no idea what his wife was doing. But the evidence told another story. He had signed the fraudulent adoption papers. He had funded the trust funds with their controlling conditions. He had overseen the construction of the locked rooms. Still, prosecutors faced a dilemma. Howard offered a plea deal. In exchange for information on additional burial sites, he would accept a reduced sentence. The choice was agonizing: to grant leniency to a man complicit in unimaginable crimes, or risk never finding the remains of more children. In the end, they agreed. Howard's cooperation led to the discovery of 3 more burial sites: a lake house in upstate New York, a hunting cabin in West Virginia, and a beach house in Maryland. 8 more children were found, bringing the total to 13 vessels. It was a chilling arithmetic. 13 vessels sacrificed to cleanse 12 redeemable children. Howard was sentenced to 25 years to life, with parole eligibility after 20. Margaret spent the rest of her days in a secure psychiatric hospital, still convinced she had been chosen by God to save children through her rituals. For the town of Millbrook, the revelations shattered every illusion. The family they had celebrated as saviors were predators hiding in plain sight. The mansion on Elm Street, once a symbol of wealth and beauty, was demolished within 2 years. In its place, the community planted a garden, each tree dedicated to one of the children whose lives had been stolen. But even as justice played out in courtrooms and memorials were built, one haunting truth remained: the full number of victims might never be known. The raid on the Falling mansion had ended the nightmare, but the scars it left behind would never fully heal. For the children who survived, the struggle was only beginning. Years of strict control, ritual punishments, and indoctrination had left them fractured in ways that no courtroom verdict could mend. The eldest, James, who had once been the Follings' pride and joy, took his own life just 3 years after the arrests. Friends later described him as haunted, unable to escape the grip of the rituals that defined his childhood. Elizabeth, the second child, battled severe anorexia for most of her adult life. She spoke in rare interviews about the constant fear of sin that had been forced into her, a fear that followed her into every meal, every relationship, every moment of adulthood. Thomas, the boy whose broken arm had first raised suspicions, vanished after turning 18. Some believed he tried to start a new life under a different name. Others feared he had met a darker fate. Some of the younger children were eventually adopted by new families. Others remained in foster care until they aged out of the system. A few managed to find stability, but most carried invisible burdens that would shape the rest of their lives. The 3 hidden children, found on the 3rd floor, were the rare exception. Eventually identified as siblings, Sofia, Mateo, and Carlos Herrera, they were reunited with their parents, migrant workers from San Diego who had reported them missing years earlier. For the Herreras, it was nothing short of a miracle. "We thought we had lost them forever," their mother said through tears. But even for the reunited family, joy was tempered by the trauma the children carried, trauma that would take a lifetime to unravel. The graves uncovered on the property, and later on the out-of-state sites, painted an even darker picture. 13 children had been reduced to vessels in Margaret's twisted theology, discarded once she believed their souls were saturated with the sins of others. Their names were etched into memorial stones when possible, but some identities remained lost. To this day, 3 victims are still known only as Jane and John Does. For the town of Millbrook, the case was a reckoning. How could something so horrific have thrived in plain sight for nearly 2 decades? The answer lay in the quiet failures of community and system alike. Neighbors who noticed oddities but stayed silent. Doctors who filed reports but saw cases closed. Officials who dismissed concerns because they couldn't believe people of such wealth and polish could commit such crimes. The impact went far beyond Millbrook. In 1998, Pennsylvania passed what became known as the Follings Act, a set of reforms designed to prevent similar tragedies. The law required more rigorous background checks for adoptive parents, capped the number of children who could be adopted by a single family within a set time frame, and mandated unannounced home visits for 5 years after an adoption. Other states soon adopted similar policies. Experts in psychology and religious studies pored over Margaret's journals, searching for explanations. Some argued her beliefs were rooted in obscure texts she had studied during travels in Europe. Others saw it as an idiosyncratic delusion, a personal cult of one. Whatever its origin, the effect was the same: a theology of control built on the suffering of children. Howard never expressed remorse. Even after cooperating with investigators to reveal additional burial sites, he insisted until his death in prison that he had only wanted to support his wife's dream of a large family. Margaret, confined to a psychiatric facility until her death in 2008, continued to perform rituals in her room, convinced she had been chosen to cleanse the world's children. For those left behind, the true legacy was not in the trials or the laws, but in the lives shattered and the names lost. Each October, on the anniversary of the raid, the people of Millbrook gather in the community garden that now stands where the mansion once loomed. Lanterns are lit for the 13 vessels, candles for the 12 children who lived under Margaret's rule. The trees planted there, 12 oaks and 13 willows, rise higher each year, their branches a quiet testimony to resilience and remembrance. "It's not enough," Detective Cooper said years later. "Nothing could ever be enough. But it's something. It's a way of saying we remember, that we'll never let their stories be buried again." Even in retirement, Cooper kept the files. He followed up on leads, however faint, refusing to let the possibility of more undiscovered victims slip away. "Someone out there is still missing their child," he said, "and they deserve answers." The case of the Follings is more than a horror story. It is a mirror reflecting how easily respectability can mask evil, how silence can enable cruelty, and how fragile the protections for the most vulnerable can be. It is a reminder that monsters are not always strangers in the dark. Sometimes they are the neighbors who smile from the porch, the benefactors at the charity gala, the ones we least suspect. Before we close, we must say their names: Maria, Tyrell, Alexei, Lucia, Wami, Tran, Sarah, Dmitri, and the 5 whose names we may never know. Children whose lives were cut short, whose suffering was hidden, whose stories must never be forgotten. This is the Ghastly Journal. If you believe these stories deserve to be told, subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss an episode. And if you or someone you know has information about a missing child, contact the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children at 1-800-THE-LOST, because even decades later, the truth can come to light. And sometimes, remembering is the only justice left.